The summer sun beat down on Willow Creek Estates, a pristine suburban neighborhood where perfectly manicured lawns stretched toward identical two-story homes. The community's reputation for exclusivity was matched only by its stringent homeowners association rules. Steve Johnson, 34, wiped sweat from his brow as he crouched beside the small table he'd set up on his front porch. 3 different routers, a laptop, and various cables were spread out before him. After 2 weeks of spotty internet in his new home, he'd finally carved out time to solve the problem. "Come on, you've got to be kidding me," Steve muttered, adjusting his glasses as he stared at the error message on his screen. As a senior software engineer at Technova Solutions, troubleshooting was literally in his job description. Yet somehow, his home network was proving more challenging than the corporate systems he managed. Steve had been excited about this move. After years of apartment living, he'd finally saved enough for a down payment on this beautiful colonial in Willow Creek. The neighborhood's proximity to both his office and his sister's family had sealed the deal. Moving in just 2 weeks ago, he'd been too busy unpacking to properly configure his home network. Across the street, Barbara Whitfield, 62, peered through her living room blinds. The retired school administrator had served as president of the Willow Creek HOA for the past 8 years, a position she wielded with uncompromising authority. She prided herself on knowing every resident and monitoring any activity that might threaten property values. "Harold," she called to her husband, who was dozing in his recliner. "There's someone I don't recognize on the Martinsons' porch." Harold grunted without opening his eyes. "The Martinsons moved, remember? Sold to some tech guy." Barbara's eyes narrowed. "I know the Martinsons sold, but we haven't met the new owners yet. And this man has all sorts of electronic equipment spread out. It looks suspicious." When Harold failed to respond, Barbara slipped on her sandals and grabbed her phone. As HOA president, it was her duty to investigate. The Neighborhood Watch program she'd established 3 years ago had already prevented 2 potential break-ins, at least according to the newsletter she wrote herself. Steve was so engrossed in his work that he didn't notice Barbara approaching until her shadow fell across his laptop. "Excuse me," she said sharply, standing with her arms crossed. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" Steve looked up, momentarily confused, then smiled. "Oh, hello. I'm just trying to fix my Wi-Fi issues. Signal keeps dropping on the 2nd floor." Barbara didn't return the smile. "And you are?" "Steve Johnson. I moved in 2 weeks ago." He stood and extended his hand, which Barbara pointedly ignored. "I wasn't informed of any new residents moving in this month," she said, her voice laced with suspicion. "The HOA is supposed to be notified of all property transfers." Steve's smile faltered. "Well, the closing was on the 15th. Maybe there's a delay in the paperwork." "I can show you. What I'm more concerned about," Barbara interrupted, "is all this equipment. Our bylaws clearly state that no technical work or repairs can be conducted in visible areas. Section 5, Paragraph 3. Steve glanced at his modest setup. "I'm not running a business or anything. I'm just fixing my own Wi-Fi." Barbara took a step closer, her eyes scanning the equipment. "That looks like professional-grade technology. Are you sure this is for personal use?" "Yes, I'm a software engineer," Steve explained patiently. "This is just better equipment than average because of my job. I need reliable internet." "A software engineer," Barbara repeated, her tone making it clear she didn't believe him. "And you supposedly live here now?" Steve felt a flash of irritation but maintained his composure. "Yes, I do live here. Like I said, I moved in 2 weeks ago." "It's interesting that I haven't seen you before," Barbara persisted. "I know everyone in this neighborhood. I've been busy unpacking, and I work long hours," Steve explained, increasingly uncomfortable with the interrogation. "Look, Ms. Whitfield. Barbara Whitfield. I'm the president of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association. Ms. Whitfield, I understand you're concerned, but I assure you, I'm the new homeowner. If you'd like, I can show you my ID and closing documents." Barbara's eyes narrowed further. Anyone can forge documents these days. "Where did you say you worked again?" Steve took a deep breath. "Technova Solutions. I'm a senior software engineer there. And they let you take equipment home? That seems unusual." "This is my personal equipment," Steve clarified, gesturing to the routers. "I bought these myself." Barbara pulled out her phone and began taking pictures of Steve's setup. "I'll need to verify all of this. We've had problems with technology theft in nearby neighborhoods." Steve felt his patience wearing thin. Ma'am, I'm not stealing anything. This is my house and my equipment. I'm simply trying to fix my internet connection. Two neighbors walking their dogs slowed down to watch the interaction. Barbara seemed encouraged by the audience. If you really live here, she challenged, then why haven't you attended any HOA meetings? All new residents are required to introduce themselves. Because I've been here for 2 weeks and have been busy settling in, Steve replied, his voice tight. I wasn't aware of any meetings. The schedule is clearly posted on the community board. Barbara shot back. Claiming ignorance of the rules doesn't exempt you from following them. Steve began gathering his equipment. Look, I don't want any trouble. I'll finish this inside. Don't move anything, Barbara commanded. If that equipment belongs to someone else, moving it could constitute theft. Steve froze, incredulous. Are you serious right now? This is my property on my porch. Prove it, Barbara demanded. Show me receipts for all of this equipment. I don't carry receipts for things I bought months or years ago, Steve replied, his frustration mounting. Barbara turned to the neighbors who had stopped to watch. Have either of you seen this man before? The couple exchanged uncomfortable glances but shook their heads. See, Barbara said triumphantly. No one recognizes you. Because I just moved in, Steve emphasized, struggling to keep his voice level. And they probably don't know half the neighborhood either. One of the neighbors, a younger woman, spoke up hesitantly. Actually, I think I did see moving trucks a couple weeks ago. Barbara silenced her with a glare. Lisa, we need to be certain. This neighborhood has standards. Steve pulled out his wallet and extracted his driver's license. Here, this shows my name and this address. The post office has already updated it. Barbara barely glanced at it. That could be fake. And why would you have so many internet devices? One router is sufficient for most homes. Not if you want comprehensive coverage and optimal speeds for working from home, Steve explained, increasingly exasperated. Working from home? Barbara latched onto this new information. That's potentially a violation of Section 8, which prohibits operating businesses from residential properties. Corporate remote work is explicitly exempted in most HOA agreements, Steve countered. I've read your bylaws. Barbara seemed taken aback by his knowledge, but quickly recovered. We'll see about that. In the meantime, I'm going to have to ask you to pack up this equipment until we can verify your claims. Steve stood his ground. No, I'm not packing anything up. This is my home, and I'm not doing anything wrong. Barbara's face reddened. Your attitude is exactly the problem. This is a respectful community with rules, and I'm following them, Steve insisted. What I'm not following are your baseless accusations. More neighbors had gathered now, drawn by the escalating voices. Barbara seemed to gain confidence from a growing audience. I've been protecting this neighborhood for 8 years, she announced loudly, and I know when something isn't right. Steve looked around at the faces watching them. Some seemed embarrassed, others curious, a few nodding along with Barbara. This is ridiculous, Steve said finally. I'm going inside to continue my work. Feel free to contact my realtor if you need verification. He began collecting his equipment. Barbara immediately pulled out her phone. I'm calling the police. Don't move anything until they arrive. Steve stopped stunned. You're calling the police? For what? Suspicious activity, potential technology theft, and violating HOA regulations, Barbara listed as she dialed. If you're legitimate, you should have no problem explaining all this to the authorities. Steve could hardly believe what was happening, but he set his router down and crossed his arms. Fine. Call them. Barbara turned slightly away as her call connected. Yes, emergency services. This is Barbara Whitfield at 421 Willow Creek Lane. I need to report suspicious activity. There's an unrecognized man with extensive electronic equipment who claims to have moved into the neighborhood. Yes, he's black. About 6 feet tall, glasses, wearing a blue t-shirt and jeans. Steve closed his eyes briefly, taking a deep breath. This wasn't the first time he'd been profiled, but in his own front yard? That was a new low. Yes, I believe this could be related to the technology thefts reported in Meadowbrook last month, Barbara continued. He's being confrontational and refuses to pack up the equipment. Please send someone immediately. As Barbara continued her call, embellishing details with each sentence, Steve pulled out his own phone and began recording. Whatever happened next, he wanted it documented. The police are on their way, Barbara announced with satisfaction after ending her call. They'll sort this out properly. I'm sure they will, Steve replied quietly, continuing to record. I'm sure they will. 20 minutes passed with excruciating slowness. Steve remained on his porch, still recording, while Barbara stood at the edge of his property with her arms crossed, occasionally narrating the situation to the growing crowd of neighbors. Some had already slipped away, embarrassed by the spectacle, while others lingered out of curiosity or concern. The police response time in this neighborhood is usually much faster, Barbara announced loudly, checking her watch for the third time. I suppose they're taking extra precautions given the situation. Steve said nothing, focusing on keeping his breathing steady. Years of similar encounters had taught him the importance of remaining calm, but this one stung differently. This was supposed to be his home, his sanctuary. A police cruiser finally turned onto Willow Creek Lane, moving at a measured pace with no lights or sirens. It pulled up in front of Steve's house, and two officers stepped out, one Latino man in his early 40s and a younger white man. That's Officers Leon Rodriguez and John Parker, one neighbor whispered to another. They handle most of the calls in this area. Barbara immediately straightened her posture and marched toward the officers, a triumphant smile spreading across her face. Steve stopped his recording, but kept his phone in hand as he slowly stood. Officers, thank you for coming so promptly, Barbara called out, reaching them before they could approach the house. I'm Barbara Whitfield, president of the Willow Creek HOA. I'm the one who reported the suspicious activity. Officer Leon nodded professionally. Ma'am, can you explain what's happening here? Barbara launched into her account, gesturing repeatedly towards Steve. This individual claims he's moved into the Peterson property, but we've received no official notification from the HOA management company. He's got all sorts of technical equipment spread out, and when questioned, he became defensive and refused to provide proper documentation. Officer John jotted notes while Officer Leon listened attentively, his expression revealing nothing. The concerning part, Barbara continued, lowering her voice conspiratorially, is that this matches the pattern of those technology thefts in Meadowbrook last month. Someone posing as a new resident to gain access to the neighborhood. Officer Leon finally held up a hand to pause her narrative. Thank you, Ms. Whitfield. We'll need to speak with the gentleman as well. Of course, Barbara replied, stepping aside but remaining close enough to hear. I'll be right here if you need any additional information about our community guidelines. The officers approached Steve, who had remained on his porch. Officer Leon took the lead, his posture relaxed but alert. Good afternoon, sir. I'm Officer Rodriguez, and this is Officer Parker. We received a call about a disturbance at this address. I'm Steve Johnson, Steve replied evenly. This is my house. I was setting up my Wi-Fi when Ms. Whitfield there decided I was a criminal. From the sidelines, Barbara huffed indignantly. That is not what happened. Officer John turned toward her. Ma'am, please let us handle this. You'll have another opportunity to speak with us. Barbara fell silent, though her expression made it clear she wasn't happy about it. Mr. Johnson, Officer Leon continued. Can I see some identification, please? Of course. Steve carefully reached for his wallet and handed over his driver's license. I just moved in 2 weeks ago. The address has already been updated. Officer Leon examined the license carefully, then handed it to Officer John, who ran it through their system on his handheld device. And what exactly were you doing out here that raised concerns? Officer Leon asked. Steve gestured to his equipment. I was troubleshooting my home network. I've been having connectivity issues on the second floor, so I was testing different router configurations. Officer John looked up from his device with an expression Steve couldn't quite read. He whispered something to Officer Leon, whose eyebrows rose slightly. Mr. Johnson, Officer Leon said, his tone shifting subtly. You work at Technova Solutions, correct? Yes, I'm a senior software engineer there, Steve confirmed, wondering how they knew his employer. A hint of a smile appeared on Officer Leon's face. Steve Johnson from Technova. The same Steve Johnson who led the cybersecurity upgrade for the county's emergency response systems last year. Barbara, who had been edging closer to eavesdrop, froze. Steve nodded, surprised. Yes, that was one of my projects. How did you know that? Officer Leon's professional demeanor softened as he extended his hand. Because you're my brother-in-law, man. Alicia's been talking about you moving to Willow Creek for months. The silence that followed was deafening. Nearby neighbors exchanged glances of confusion and dawning realization. "Wait," Steve said, staring at Officer Leon. "You're Leon? Alicia's husband, Leon? I thought you were on vacation this week. That's why she said you couldn't help me move in." Leon grinned. "Got back early. Didn't realize you'd moved into Willow Creek already. Alicia said you were looking at a few neighborhoods. This place had the best schools for when I eventually start a family," Steve explained, his tension visibly melting away. "Plus, being close to you guys was a major selling point." Barbara's face had drained of color. She took a faltering step forward. "Officer, you know this man personally?" Leon turned to her, his expression cooling. "Mr. Johnson is married to my sister, Ms. Whitfield. He's also one of the leading cybersecurity experts in the county. In fact, he's the one who helped secure our police department systems against ransomware attacks last year." "Ah, I had no way of knowing that," Barbara stammered. "You also had no evidence of any wrongdoing," Officer John pointed out, his tone measured but firm. "Yet you called 911 reporting a potential theft in progress." "I was concerned about the neighborhood's safety," Barbara insisted. "There have been incidents in nearby communities." "Ms. Whitfield," Officer Leon interrupted, "this is the third call you've made this month about suspicious individuals who turned out to be legitimate residents or service providers. Each time, the individuals in question have been people of color." Several neighbors who had been watching the scene unfold began to mutter among themselves. "That's completely unrelated," Barbara protested. "I would have reported anyone behaving suspiciously." "Your definition of suspicious seems rather selective," Officer John remarked, checking something on his device. "According to our records, you didn't report the Anderson teenagers when they were going door-to-door for their unauthorized fundraiser last week. They were in violation of the township solicitation ordinance." "That was different," Barbara insisted. "I knew who they were." "But you didn't know they lacked the proper permits," Officer Leon pointed out, which was an actual violation, unlike a homeowner setting up Wi-Fi on his own property. Officer John cleared his throat. "Ms. Whitfield, I should inform you that we've been monitoring the pattern of calls from this neighborhood following concerns raised by several residents." This revelation sent another ripple through the watching crowd. Barbara's gaze darted nervously from face to face. "What do you mean, monitoring?" she demanded. "After receiving multiple complaints about potential discriminatory reporting, the department has been tracking all calls from Willow Creek Estates to identify patterns of bias," Officer John explained. "Part of our community relations initiative." "This is outrageous," Barbara sputtered. "I was performing my duty as HOA president." "Actually," a voice called from the crowd, "the HOA bylaws don't authorize you to question residents about their identities or belongings." A middle-aged woman stepped forward. "I'm Diane Phillips, HOA secretary. The board limited those powers last year after several incidents." Barbara's face flushed crimson. "Diane, you know as well as I do that we have protocols for new residents. Protocols that don't include harassment or calling the police without cause," Diane countered firmly. Officer Leon turned to Barbara. "Ms. Whitfield, I need to inform you that making false reports to emergency services is a serious offense. Additionally, this entire interaction has been recorded on our body cameras." For the first time, Barbara seemed to notice the small cameras attached to both officers' uniforms, their indicator lights glowing steadily. "I didn't make a false report," she insisted, her voice rising. "I genuinely believe there was suspicious activity occurring." "Based on what evidence?" Officer John asked. "A resident using electronic equipment on his own property? He couldn't prove he lived here." Barbara exclaimed. Steve held up his driver's license. "Actually, I offer to show you this in my closing documents, which you refused to look at." Several neighbors nodded, confirming his account. Officer Leon sighed deeply. "Ms. Whitfield, please step over here with me for a moment." He guided her several feet away while Officer John remained with Steve. "I'm really sorry about this," Officer John said quietly to Steve. "For what it's worth, your sister-in-law has mentioned you several times at department events. She's very proud of your work." Steve managed a small smile. "Thanks. I didn't expect my first month here to include a police visit." Meanwhile, Leon was speaking to Barbara in low, serious tones. Her indignation gradually gave way to genuine concern as the conversation continued. Occasionally, she would attempt to interrupt, but each time, Leon would firmly redirect the conversation. The crowd of neighbors had begun to disperse, though several remained watching from a distance, phones discreetly recording the scene. After several minutes, Leon and Barbara returned. Barbara's earlier confidence had completely evaporated, replaced by a tightly controlled anxiety. "Mr. Johnson," she said stiffly, "it appears there has been a misunderstanding. I apologize for the inconvenience." Steve nodded but said nothing. Officer Leon addressed the remaining onlookers. "Folks, there's no emergency here. Just a miscommunication between neighbors. I'd appreciate it if everyone would return to their homes now." Most of the neighbors complied, though not without significant glances and whispered comments. Within moments, only Steve, the officers, and Barbara remained. "We'll be filing a report about this incident," Officer John informed Barbara. "You'll likely be contacted by the Community Relations Division for a follow-up conversation." "Is that really necessary?" Barbara asked, her voice suddenly small. "Standard procedure," Leon replied firmly. "Now, I believe Mr. Johnson would like to return to setting up his home network without further interruption." Barbara nodded jerkily and began to retreat toward her house. After a few steps, she turned back. "This isn't what it looks like," she insisted. "I'm not. I didn't mean." "We'll discuss it during the follow-up," Officer John said, effectively dismissing her. Once Barbara was out of earshot, Leon turned to Steve with a grimace. "Welcome to the neighborhood, I guess. Alicia's going to flip when she hears about this." "At least now I know why she recommended this place so highly," Steve replied dryly. "Built-in police protection." Both officers chuckled, breaking some of the tension. "Seriously, though," Leon said, his expression sobering, "Barbara Whitfield has been on our radar for a while. This isn't her first false report. We've received multiple complaints about her targeting new residents, particularly minorities," Officer John added. "But this is the first time we've caught it in progress, with supporting evidence." Steve raised an eyebrow. "So what happens now?" Leon glanced toward Barbara's house, where she could be seen peering through her blinds. "No, the department follows up. And between you and me, the timing couldn't be better." "What do you mean?" Steve asked. Officer John smiled slightly. "Let's just say Ms. Whitfield isn't the only one being investigated in Willow Creek Estates. But that's all I can share at the moment." Leon placed a hand on Steve's shoulder. "Come over for dinner tomorrow. Alicia's making her famous lasagna to celebrate your move. And now we have even more to talk about." As the officers prepared to leave, Steve couldn't help but notice Barbara frantically making phone calls in her living room, her gestures becoming increasingly agitated. Something told him this wasn't the end of the story, merely the beginning of a reckoning long overdue. "One more thing," Leon said, pausing by his cruiser. "You might want to set up a security camera on your porch. Just in case." "Already ordered," Steve replied. "Should arrive tomorrow." The officers nodded approvingly before driving away, leaving Steve to finally return to his Wi-Fi configuration, now with considerably more neighborhood knowledge than he'd had an hour ago. 3 days after the incident, Steve's doorbell rang just as he was finishing his morning coffee. On his front porch stood Diane Phillips, the HOA secretary who had spoken up during the confrontation. "Good morning, Mr. Johnson," she said warmly. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all," Steve replied, gesturing for her to come in. "And please call me Steve." Diane stepped inside, clutching a folder to her chest. "Steve, I wanted to personally apologize for what happened the other day. That's not how we welcome new residents to Willow Creek." "I appreciate that," Steve said, offering her a seat in the living room. "Coffee?" "No, thank you. I can't stay long." Diane settled onto the couch, her expression turning serious. "There's been an emergency HOA board meeting called for this evening. I thought you should know." Steve raised an eyebrow. "Because of what happened with Barbara?" "Partly," Diane confirmed. "But there's more." She opened her folder and extracted several documents. "For the past year, I've been documenting incidents involving Barbara's selective enforcement of HOA rules." Steve scanned the papers, detailed accounts of confrontations, complete with dates, witnesses, and outcomes. "This is thorough," he remarked. "I'm an accountant," Diane explained with a small smile. "Documentation is second nature. But what I discovered accidentally yesterday is far more concerning." She pulled out another document, a spreadsheet showing unusual financial transactions in the HOA accounts. Barbara has been running an unlicensed property management business from her home, using HOA resources and our membership database to identify potential clients. Steve's eyes widened. That's against HOA rules, isn't it? And possibly illegal, Diane added. She's been accessing confidential information about resident homes, mortgages, and contact details. The board never authorized this. Does she know you found this? Steve asked. Diane shook her head. Not yet. But after what happened with you, several other residents came forward with similar stories. Then Officer Parker contacted us about their ongoing investigation. Investigation? Apparently, the police department received complaints about identity theft in the neighborhood 6 months ago. They've been quietly investigating, and Barbara's name kept coming up. Steve sat back, processing this information. So my incident was just the catalyst. The final straw, Diane corrected. The meeting tonight is to remove Barbara from the board and cooperate fully with the police investigation. Just then, Steve's phone buzzed with a text from Leon. Hey bro, big developments in the Whitfield case. Call me. Diane stood to leave. The meeting's at 7 p.m. in the community center. I thought you might want to attend, given your unique perspective. After she left, Steve called Leon immediately. You won't believe this, Leon said without preamble. Remember how John mentioned other investigations? Turns out Barbara has been running background checks on new residents using police resources. How is that possible? Steve asked. Her cousin works in our records department. Both are being investigated now. But here's the kicker. We found evidence Barbara has been selling information about vacant homes to a real estate investment group. That's how she knew when houses were coming on the market before anyone else. Like mine, Steve realized. Exactly. The investor group wanted your place badly, but you outbid them. Barbara was furious because she lost her commission. That evening, Steve arrived at the community center to find it packed with residents. Barbara sat rigidly at the front, her expression defiant despite being flanked by officers Leon and John. Diane called the meeting to order and methodically presented the evidence against Barbara. Unauthorized use of HOA resources, privacy violations, discriminatory reporting practices, and potential financial impropriety. When Barbara attempted to defend herself, multiple residents stood to share their own experiences, creating a devastating pattern that couldn't be dismissed. Furthermore, Diane continued, the police have evidence that Ms. Whitfield has been selling residents' private information to third parties without consent. Gasps echoed through the room as Officer John stepped forward to confirm this statement. This is a witch hunt, Barbara protested. I've protected this neighborhood for years. By profiling new residents, someone called out. By violating our privacy, added another. The vote to remove Barbara was unanimous, her face ashen as reality set in. As the meeting concluded, Steve found himself surrounded by neighbors introducing themselves properly for the first time. We need a security expert on the board, Diane suggested quietly. Someone who understands privacy concerns and modern technology. 6 months later, Steve Johnson pressed the doorbell at 421 Willow Creek Lane, once Barbara's house, now occupied by a young family. As the newest HOA board member, he was delivering welcome packets personally to all new residents. The door opened to reveal a smiling woman holding a toddler. Hi, I'm Steve from the HOA Welcome Committee, he said warmly. I wanted to personally welcome you to Willow Creek and invite you to our community tech workshop next Saturday. We're teaching everyone how to secure their home networks. Behind him, Officer Leon was setting up a demonstration booth for the police department's new community alert system, designed by Steve's team at Technova, to foster genuine neighborhood security without profiling or fear. As for Barbara Whitfield, last Steve heard, she was serving community service hours at the county's Diversity and Inclusion Center, a fitting conclusion to her reign of suspicion and a powerful reminder that karma eventually balances all accounts.